They say some lines are never meant to be crossed. I used to believe that too, until the day I realized I was standing on the edge, looking over, unable to step back. It all started with my journal, the one place I thought my secrets were safe. But when Nathan, my stepson, opened it and looked at me with those searching eyes, everything I thought I knew about myself began to unravel. I never thought I'd find myself in this position. For years, I prided myself on being the kind of person who could handle anything. When my husband passed, I held everything together: the house, the finances, even Nathan, who was struggling in his own way. The silence in the house became my new normal, and I convinced myself that I was fine. I didn't need anyone else. I had my routines, and they were enough. At least, that's what I told myself. When Nathan moved back in after his latest breakup, I told myself it was temporary. He'll be gone soon, I thought. But in those first few weeks, something shifted. The house didn't feel as empty anymore. His music drifted down the stairs, his laughter filled the quiet spaces, and his sneakers scattered near the door became a strange comfort. Nathan wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a man. And that realization hit me harder than I wanted to admit. He'd grown into someone thoughtful, observant, and kind. He'd linger in the kitchen while I cooked, telling me about his day or asking about mine. His attention felt different, like he saw me in a way no one else had in years. But that was nothing compared to the day he found my journal. I had left it out by accident, something I never do. When I walked back into the living room and saw him holding it, my breath caught. "What's this?" he asked, his voice light but curious. I froze, panic rising in my chest. "It's private," I said, snatching it from his hands. But the look on his face stayed with me, curious, thoughtful, and understanding in a way that made my stomach twist. Nathan didn't push, but that moment opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through. I told myself to ignore it, to keep my distance, but the truth was impossible to ignore. I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt seen, and that terrified me. I tried to pretend nothing had changed after that moment with the journal. I told myself that I was overthinking things, that Nathan wasn't looking at me differently. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It started small. The way his eyes lingered just a little too long when we spoke, the way he leaned closer when we sat together, the way his presence filled the room in a way I couldn't ignore. I caught myself noticing things about him I hadn't before. The curve of his smile, the quiet confidence in his voice, the way his laughter made the house feel alive again. It was ridiculous. I was his stepmother, for God's sake. What was wrong with me? But Nathan made it hard to stay detached. He was thoughtful in a way that chipped away at my defenses. One afternoon, he offered to fix the faucet in the kitchen, which had been dripping for weeks. As I stood there, watching him work under the sink, I found myself talking to him in a way I hadn't with anyone in years. He asked me questions, real questions, not the surface-level pleasantries I was used to. "What do you miss most about Dad?" he asked, his voice quiet, genuine. The question hit me like a punch to the chest. "I miss feeling like someone saw me," I admitted before I could stop myself. Nathan sat back on his heels, wiping his hands with a rag. "I see you," he said simply, his gaze steady. The weight of his words hung between us, and I had to look away before my emotions betrayed me. After that, the tension between us became impossible to ignore. One evening, as we were sitting on the couch watching a movie, I felt his arm brush against mine. It was such a small thing, but it sent a shiver through me. I moved away, pretending to adjust the blanket, but my heart was racing. Did he notice? Did he feel it too? The turning point came when Nathan invited me to have dinner with him. "Just something simple," he said. I've been practicing my cooking. I knew I should say no. I knew I should keep my distance. But the look in his eyes, the way he smiled, made it impossible to refuse. When I arrived at the table, I saw the care he had put into everything. The candles, the neatly folded napkins, the perfectly plated food. It was more than just a casual dinner. And the way he looked at me across the table? It wasn't casual either. "You deserve this," he said softly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "You do so much for everyone else. Let someone take care of you for a change." I didn't know what to say. The words caught in my throat, and I felt tears sting at the corners of my eyes. "Thank you," I managed, my voice trembling. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way he made me feel. About the way I was starting to feel about him. It wasn't right. I knew that. But knowing didn't make it stop. Nathan wasn't making it easy either. The next morning, he left a note on the kitchen counter. "Let me know if there's anything you need today. I'm here." His words stayed with me all day, a quiet reminder of the growing connection between us. I told myself it was nothing, that I could control it. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was standing on the edge of something dangerous, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to walk away. I thought I could keep it under control. I thought I could draw a line and hold it. But the truth was, every moment I spent with Nathan blurred that line until I couldn't tell where it was anymore. It wasn't one big thing. It was everything. The way he lingered in the kitchen while I cooked, offering to chop vegetables or set the table. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me, like he was sharing a secret only I was meant to hear. And then there was the way he looked at me. Not just casually, but deeply. Like he could see straight into the parts of me I tried to keep hidden. The shift came one evening after dinner. Nathan had poured me a glass of wine, and we sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The conversation was light at first, small talk about the weather, his plans for the future. But then he turned to me, his expression serious. "You know," he said, his voice low, "you're not what I expected." I frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" "When I moved back in," he said, "I thought you'd be different. Distant, maybe. But you're not. You're real. You care. You see people." His words caught me off guard. "Of course I care," I said quietly. "It's what I do." Nathan shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "It's more than that. You don't just care. You make people feel like they matter." I didn't know what to say to that. My chest tightened, and I looked away, focusing on the fading light in the sky. "You matter too," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long silence, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. And then Nathan reached out, his hand brushing lightly against mine. It was such a small thing, but it sent a shiver through me. I should have pulled away. I should have said something. But I didn't. Instead, I let his hand linger, let myself feel the warmth of his touch. "Evelyn," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't want to make things harder for you, but I need you to know. I see you. I really see you." My breath caught, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. "Nathan," I began, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say. How could I? How could I explain the war raging inside me, the guilt, the fear, the undeniable pull toward him? Nathan didn't push. He just sat there, his hand still lightly touching mine, waiting. And in that moment, something inside me cracked. I turned to him, my eyes meeting his, and I saw the vulnerability there, the quiet yearning that mirrored my own. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered, my voice shaking. I don't know how to feel this and not lose myself. You don't have to do it alone, Nathan said, his voice steady. I'm here. The words were simple, but they hit me like a wave. For so long I had carried everything on my own. The grief, the loneliness, the weight of trying to hold it all together. And here was Nathan, offering to share it, to lighten the load. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. I leaned back, trying to steady my breathing, but Nathan didn't move. His presence was grounding, and yet it made me feel like I was on the edge of something I couldn't control. We shouldn't do this, I said finally, my voice barely audible. I know, he replied, but that doesn't make it any less real. His honesty disarmed me, and before I could stop myself, I reached out, my fingers brushing against his. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental, like crossing a line I could never uncross. Nathan's eyes searched mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. There was only him, only the quiet intensity of his gaze and the warmth of his hand in mine. Tell me to stop, he said softly. If you want me to stop, just say the word. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I let the moment linger, let myself feel the pull between us. When his hand moved to my cheek, his touch was so gentle it made my heart ache. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. His lips met mine, and the kiss was soft, tentative, like he was giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into him, my hands clutching his shirt as the kiss deepened. The world faded away. The worries, the guilt, the fear. All that mattered was him and the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths were ragged, and the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. This is crazy, I whispered, my voice trembling. Maybe, Nathan said, his voice soft. But it's ours. And as I looked into his eyes, I knew he was right. It didn't matter how complicated or forbidden it was. In that moment, it felt real. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was truly living. I woke the next morning with a heavy chest and a mind that refused to quiet. The memory of the kiss lingered on my lips, filling me with both exhilaration and dread. I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling as the reality of what had happened sank in. I had crossed a line, one I never thought I would. And now, there was no going back. Nathan was gone by the time I came downstairs. His sneakers, usually by the door, were missing, and I told myself that was for the best. I needed space. Time to think. But the house felt too quiet without him, and I hated that I noticed. I spent the day trying to distract myself, throwing myself into cleaning, cooking, anything to keep my mind busy. But every time I stopped, even for a moment, my thoughts returned to him. His touch, his words, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. By the time evening came, I was exhausted. I settled on the couch with a glass of wine, hoping it would help me relax. But then I heard the front door open, and my heart skipped a beat. Nathan stepped inside, his expression cautious. He hesitated when he saw me, his hand lingering on the doorknob. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone careful. I nodded, my stomach churning as he walked over and sat down across from me. For a long moment neither of us spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken tension. "I'm sorry," Nathan said finally, breaking the stillness. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." "You didn't," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "I did. I let it happen." Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I don't regret it," he said softly. "But if you do, I understand." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I don't know how I feel, I admitted, my voice breaking. I don't know what to do. You don't have to figure it out right now, he said gently. But I need you to know that I care about you, Evelyn. I always have. I felt tears sting at the corners of my eyes, and I looked away, my hands gripping the wineglass tightly. It's not that simple, I whispered. This isn't right. Why not? Nathan asked, his voice quiet but insistent. Because of what people would think? Because it's not what you're supposed to feel? Because it's wrong, I said, my voice shaking. Because I'm supposed to be better than this. Nathan's gaze softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against mine. You don't have to be perfect, he said. You're allowed to feel, Evelyn. You're allowed to want something for yourself. I pulled my hand away, tears spilling down my cheeks. I can't, I said, shaking my head. I can't do this. Nathan nodded slowly, his expression filled with quiet sadness. I understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But that doesn't change how I feel about you. He stood, his movements hesitant, as if he didn't want to leave but knew he had to. If you ever need me, he said, I'm here. As the door closed behind him, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where he had been, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I had pushed him away, but the feelings didn't go with him. They stayed, lingering in the air, in my chest, in every corner of the house. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the windows. I stayed in bed longer than I should have. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the windows. I stayed in bed longer than I should have, my mind replaying every moment with Nathan. I thought about the way he looked at me, the way his touch made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. And I thought about the weight of what I had done, the betrayal I had allowed to happen, not just to the memory of my husband, but to myself. I finally dragged myself out of bed and went downstairs. The house felt eerily quiet, and I realized with a pang of guilt that I missed the sound of Nathan's music drifting down from his room. I missed him. By the time afternoon came, I couldn't stand the silence anymore. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, the cool rain soaking through the fabric almost immediately. I didn't care. I walked without direction, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. I found myself at the park, standing beneath the shelter of an old oak tree. I thought about my husband, about the life we had built together, and the promises I had made to him. I thought about Nathan, about the way he made me feel like I was waking up after years of sleep. And I thought about myself, about the woman I used to be, and the woman I wanted to be. When I finally returned home, Nathan was sitting on the porch, his hair damp from the rain. He stood when he saw me, his expression cautious. I was worried about you, he said softly. I stopped a few feet away, my chest tightening as I looked at him. Nathan, I trailed off, unsure of what I wanted to say. It's okay, he said, his voice steady. You don't have to say anything. But I did. I had to say something. I don't know how to do this, I admitted, my voice trembling. I don't know how to stop feeling this way. Nathan stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. Then don't, he said simply. Don't fight it. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I felt my breath catch, my chest tightening as I searched his face for answers. I don't know if I can, I whispered. You can, he said gently. And I'll be here, no matter what. As the rain continued to fall, I realized I was standing on the edge of a choice that could change everything. And for the first time, I wasn't sure which way to step. The days after that conversation were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. Nathan's words echoed in my mind, His quiet confession, his unwavering presence, his willingness to let me figure things out at my own pace. But the weight of it all, the guilt, the fear, the uncertainty, was crushing. I avoided him at first. It was easier that way. Easier to put distance between us than to face the storm brewing inside me. But avoiding Nathan didn't make the feelings go away. If anything, it made them stronger. The quiet moments of the day, the spaces where he used to linger, now felt unbearably empty. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a faint knock at my door. My heart leapt into my throat as I debated whether to answer. But before I could decide, Nathan's voice came softly through the door. "Evelyn, I just want to say goodnight. I won't bother you." The simplicity of his words broke something in me. I didn't respond, but I heard his footsteps retreating, and the ache in my chest grew heavier. I didn't sleep that night. The following morning, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed clarity. I needed to understand what I wanted, not just for myself, but for my relationship with Nathan. I spent the day journaling, pouring my thoughts onto the page, trying to untangle the web of emotions that had ensnared me. By the time the sun began to set, I had made a decision. I found Nathan in the backyard, sitting on the porch swing, his shoulders slumped as he stared out at the garden. He looked up when he heard me approach, his expression guarded. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Of course," he said, scooting over to make room for me. I sat down beside him, the swing creaking softly beneath our weight. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like a fragile thread. "I don't know how to do this," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to reconcile what I feel for you with everything else." Nathan nodded, his gaze steady. "I know it's not easy," he said. "And I don't want to make things harder for you. But I also don't want to pretend like this doesn't exist." "I can't keep living with this guilt," I admitted, tears welling in my eyes. "I feel like I'm betraying everyone. My husband, myself, even you." Nathan reached out, his hand covering mine. "You're not betraying anyone," he said softly. "You're human, Evelyn. You're allowed to feel. You're allowed to want." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt the tears spill over. "I don't know if I can be that person," I whispered. "The person who lets herself be happy." Nathan's grip on my hand tightened. "You don't have to decide everything right now," he said. "But you deserve to figure it out. You deserve to feel alive again." For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice trembling, "for being patient with me." Nathan smiled, a faint but genuine expression. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Take all the time you need." Over the next few weeks, I began to focus on myself. I spent more time journaling, reconnecting with old friends, and doing the things I used to love: reading, gardening, painting. I started to feel like I was reclaiming parts of myself I had forgotten. Nathan and I found a new rhythm, one that felt less charged, but no less meaningful. We shared quiet moments, lingering conversations, and a mutual understanding that neither of us wanted to rush anything. There were still moments of tension, a glance that lingered too long, a touch that sent a shiver down my spine, but we both knew the importance of boundaries. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Nathan turned to me and said, "I don't regret anything, Evelyn. Not one moment." I looked at him, my chest tightening with the weight of his words. "I don't either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The honesty of that moment felt like a release, a letting go of the guilt I had been carrying. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew I was finally starting to find my way. As the weeks turned into months, the intensity of my feelings for Nathan began to shift. They didn't disappear, but they softened. evolving into something more manageable. I realized that what I felt for him wasn't just about him. It was about me. About the parts of myself I had buried, the things I had denied for so long. Nathan remained a steady presence in my life, supportive and understanding without pushing me. And as I continued to rebuild myself, I found that the weight of our shared history no longer felt so heavy. It became something I could carry, something that didn't define me but reminded me of how far I had come. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, Nathan turned to me with a small smile. "You're different," he said. "Happier." I nodded, a genuine smile spreading across my face. "I think I'm finally figuring out who I am," I said. Nathan's smile widened, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It never could be. But it was enough. Months had passed, and while life hadn't fully returned to normal, it had settled into a quieter, more manageable rhythm. Nathan and I had found a way to coexist, balancing the complexities of our relationship with a mutual respect for the boundaries we both knew were necessary. For me, the journey had been one of rediscovery. I spent time reflecting on who I had become in the years since my husband's death, and what I wanted for myself moving forward. The guilt I carried for what happened between Nathan and me didn't vanish overnight, but it softened, replaced by a deeper understanding of my own humanity. I had spent so many years being the caretaker, the strong one, the person who held everything together. I had told myself that was enough, that I didn't need more. But Nathan had forced me to confront the truth. I did need more. I needed to feel alive, to feel seen, to allow myself to want and to dream again. And while my connection with him had been messy and complicated, it had also been the catalyst for the change I so desperately needed. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, the sun dipping below the horizon in a blaze of orange and pink, Nathan broke the comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly, his voice barely carrying over the gentle hum of the cicadas. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the question settle, turning it over in my mind. "No," I said finally. "I regret the way it happened, the pain it caused. But I don't regret what it taught me." Nathan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You've changed," he said after a moment. "You seem lighter." I smiled, a genuine smile that felt like it came from somewhere deep within me. "I think I've finally stopped pretending," I said. "Stop pretending that I'm fine, that I don't need anyone, that I don't deserve to be happy." Nathan turned to look at me then, his expression soft but serious. "You do deserve to be happy," he said. "You always have." His words hung in the air, and I felt their weight settle in my chest. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. "For everything." Nathan nodded, and for the first time, I felt a sense of closure. Not just with him, but with myself. The path forward wasn't entirely clear, but I knew I was on it. I had learned to let go of the guilt that had held me captive, to forgive myself for being human, and to embrace the possibility of happiness. As the months turned into years, Nathan moved out, finding his own place and building a life for himself. We stayed close, our bond shifting into something more sustainable, more grounded. He was no longer the anchor for my emotions, but a part of my story, a reminder of the time I allowed myself to feel again. I started to find joy in the little things. The way the sunlight streamed through the windows in the morning, the sound of laughter with old friends, the quiet satisfaction of a life lived honestly. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy, but it was real. Looking back, I realized that the person I had become was stronger, braver, and more compassionate, not just toward others, but toward myself. Nathan had been the spark, the reminder that it was okay to want more, to step outside the lines I had drawn for myself. And though our story had its share of pain and mistakes, it also had its share of lessons. It taught me that life is messy, that love doesn't always fit into neat little boxes, and that sometimes the hardest thing we can do is forgive ourselves. As I sat alone on the porch one quiet evening, watching the stars emerge one by one, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. What would you have done if you were in my position? Life is messy, and sometimes the hardest choices teach us the most about ourselves. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more tales that dive deep into the complexities of human emotions. You won't want to miss what's next.